Welcome to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and their journey. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the co-host of this show. And for those who are new to this podcast, check out the archives. We've got some great interviews with smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of all kinds of companies and organizations. And I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, which is a company that helps B2B business owners to connect with their ideal prospects through podcasts and content marketing. And this episode is brought to you by EO San Francisco. EO San Francisco is the local chapter in the San Francisco Bay Area of Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global peer-to-peer network of 18,000 plus influential business owners, 200 or so chapters worldwide. And if you are the founder, co-founder, owner, or controlling shareholder of a company that generates over $1 million a year in revenue, and you want to connect with other like-minded, successful entrepreneurs, EO is for you. And you can learn more about how it works or come check out a test drive at eonetwork.org/San Francisco. All right. And my guest here today is Nav Avloni, and she is a lawyer like me, except she actually practices, which I don't anymore. And she's got a great story. She's got a social justice firm, and she's a trial attorney headquartered here in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's doing a lot of interesting work. So we're going to get into that whole story. But Nav, I want to start first with your background. So you were born in Uzbekistan, grew up there partly until you were around age 9. And before you became a trial attorney, one of your big inspirations was your grandmother, who kind of inspired you to go to law school. So tell us a little bit about her.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on. So I grew up in Uzbekistan, and I was raised primarily by my grandmother before we moved to the States with my family. And my grandmother is phenomenal. She is a phenomenal role model. She was actually one of the youngest law school students back in Uzbekistan, and then she grew up in ranks very high. She always stuck to, her core values. It always came down to what was right, what was the right thing to do. And, my childhood was actually filled with anecdotes from her about her decision making. I recall her sharing an anecdote with me where she was a prosecutor, and I guess somebody was trying to get her to be lenient in a sentencing. And I recall they, I guess, offered her jewelry, and her response was, "Why would I want to cover my skin? Like, I have beautiful skin." And then someone offered her a car, and she's like, "I'm sorry, I don't have a garage. It would be stolen." So she always had a very respectful way of denying, and she's always stayed very, very honest to, what she truly believed in. And I think at the end, um, it showed because she just had so many people who deeply respected her in the community on both sides of the criminal bench. And so I grew up watching my grandmother, who retired shortly after I was born, to watch after me because both of my parents were working professionals. But she's always had people come in asking her for advice, asking her for input. And so I've had the privilege of having her provide me with all of these little gems and lessons here and there, which I really, carry with me to today.
Yeah. And I think here, in the United States, like 2 generations back, there weren't that many women that were members of the bar. Was that the case also in Uzbekistan, where there were fewer women that were active lawyers? And, as a kid, did you appreciate how much of a kind of trailblazer she was?
It's such an interesting culture, or the time when I was in Uzbekistan growing up, because on one hand we had a very conservative streak where women didn't have a lot of rights in certain respects when it came within the family. In some situations, it was very patriarchal. But because of communism, where, women were, encouraged to work within all fields, women were given opportunities to go to school, women were given opportunities to study, to, explore all areas. So it was a very interesting juxtaposition where you have quite a decent amount of advancement for women within the profession, where there were a good amount of women that I think at least during, my trips back, that were in positions of power, not, very high, but still, But at the same time, you had the family relationships where it was still very much focused on, a patriarchal culture where, the man is the head of the household. And even though his wife might be working in a higher position because, she's a member of this party or whatnot, or she's, an engineer because in the communist culture, people could go into engineering, into mathematics, be professors as women. And so, but you still had, a husband who still directed his wife around the home in a very like, old fashioned manner. And same thing within kids. I still remember going to a gathering and I wanted some additional food because I guess it was a big feast and I was like, "Oh, just gonna take more." And they're like, "No, for your brother first." My brother is a tiny kid who didn't like to eat, but it's just that mindset, which was,
Mm,
such a contrast to um, how I guess professional woman versus the housewife woman,
yeah, yeah.
different.
And so you actually, at about age 9, your father had been studying overseas at Moscow University, actually studied with a professor who ended up winning a Nobel Prize. Your father was involved in that, but you ended up moving to the United States at the age of 9, which is kind of a big change at that age to move the country, that you've known to the United States. What was that experience like for you, and how did that, affect who you are today?
Yeah, no, it was it was definitely a time that has impacted me, I think, and continues to impact me. My father actually, who I didn't see as much growing up because he was studying at MGU, which is Moscow State University. I had the first opportunity to live with him like all the time, and have a dad. And my mom, who actually traveled quite a bit when I was in Uzbekistan, was all of a sudden, staying with us at home. So that aspect was very nice. It was amazing to have both parents. While I loved being raised by my grandmother, there's still nothing like parents, um, you know, so that was wonderful. My dad actually worked with a professor at UPenn, which is after we moved, who ended up getting a Nobel Prize on a project that my dad worked with him. So it was actually in the States that happened. Um, but I have to say I was blown away. I still remember going, I think within our first week of moving to the States, I remember going to a grocery store and looking at their rainbow shelves of ice creams and the variety of flavors, and my mind was just blown. I was like, whoa. And that goes both ways because, now I understand consumerism society, and it has its pros and cons. And, I still remember going to a movie theater and just being blown away by
Hmm.
the the luxury that America had to offer. At the same time, of course, I had moments where that were awkward, not being able to speak English at all, having to transition, uh, having my statements be mistaken as something else for, a humorous effect, let's say, by my third grade or fourth grade friend. So there were definitely moments of that I would say were a little bit uncomfortable, but for the most part, I think we, I was I had a very good experience, a transitional experience, and I think our family was very much welcomed by everyone around us into the community. So we integrated, I would say, relatively quickly.
Yeah, and we'll get into the work that you do now, but I know also when you were growing up, you traveled back to Uzbekistan semi-regularly, and it was kind of during this time period that you were aware of the sexual assaults that were happening, and that in part inspired you to do the work that you do today.
Yeah, so my family is very close in Uzbekistan, and my mom and my dad made a strong effort to keep our ties um, to Uzbekistan. So we would visit every 2 years, I'd say, over the summers. And so I had a chance to um, stay in close contact with family members, with friends, to some extent. And yeah, I remember, as I was getting older and I was reaching my early teens, um, everyone was asking, or actually even late teens, like, you need to start thinking about, marriage and whatnot. And, And it's a very different culture, very different perception of, how relationships work, of course. But one of the things I noticed that I think really triggered me is, knowing some people that are close to me who had gotten married, in Uzbekistan, and who, when you get married in Uzbekistan, you will sometimes have to go live with your husband's family. And in one, actually two particular situations, I know an incident where there's some very serious, violent domestic abuse that took place, and the individual came back home, and in at least two cases, she was advised to go back. I know an incident where actually she was told, another close person of mine was told not to go back, and I applauded her parents. I was like, "Oh my god, yes, like, that's insane. It blows my mind." But, in at least, a couple of other situations, they were told to go back, and it just blew my mind how, you know, how this abuse is not only perpetrated by somebody who's doing it, but it's supported by others, and it it was incredibly upsetting, and especially having seen the trauma and the emotional toll that it takes on the individual. And this isn't limited to Uzbekistan. I mean, this can happen anywhere. But I think that was my first exposure to it, where I've seen that happen. And of course, it happens here in the States. I hear about, I mean, this is my area of law. So, I mean, I see this happening on a regular basis, but that was my first exposure to it. And it really uh, triggered something in me where I was, I wanted to help in any way I could. And I wish I had some sort of power then to do something so they wouldn't have to go back. Something, and I felt very hopeless. And um, I'm very lucky today because at least in some ways I am able to help some of those women and men. And it feels amazing being able to do that.
And was there a moment in time or an age when you remember thinking, I'm going to go to law school and this is the work that I'm going to commit myself to, or did that come later?
I think it came on pretty early on. I think I knew pretty early on. I think I wanted to do some sort of law, in part because of my grandma, in part because I love the political debates I had with my family over a dinner table. You can imagine a clash of cultures here happening. And so I really enjoy the debates, debating with my family members. I really enjoyed um, studying about various legal systems. But I've always thought I would be a human rights attorney, international human rights attorney. But when I had some exposure to working in an international organization and realized how long things take to progress, I just realized my personality, it just, really would, I think, thrive in an environment where you can have a much more instant,
Yeah.
progress in that area. So I was like, civil rights, civil law, that's perfect.
That international human rights work is really like measured in like generations, isn't
Exactly.
it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Very different timeline.
And what was your family that was back in Uzbekistan? What did they think about you coming to America? What was their perception of that experience for you?
I think our family has always been very supportive in every way. I mean, and I think they're supportive and proud.
Mm. And what were the debates that you were talking about around the
Oh,
dinner table?
I was mostly with my dad. You know, they would vary. They would vary about, the appropriate time to talk back versus bite your tongue. And why some can do it versus others cannot. Sometimes it involved politics. Sometimes it involved, sensitive issues, but or gender related issues. I was always, for me, I was always passionate, I would say. I think going back even to our dinner table arguments about the inequality within genders, at least what I perceived growing up, and not only in Uzbekistan, but in America too. I think those are some of the debates we've had, and that's, I think, like that interest level continued to be fueled on over the years.
So you go to law school, you end up joining a civil rights law firm where you were involved in actually a number of high profile cases, including one against Tesla. Talk a little bit about some of the cases you worked on.
Yeah. Um, I worked at the California Civil Rights Law Group. It was a great experience. I had an opportunity, and I still recall the very first Tesla case we got. I recall my paralegal calling me saying, "Nav, you should come to the office right now." I remember coming to the office and seeing this black man in front of her crying. And I was like, "Whoa, what just happened?"
Yeah.
So I remember summoning him to the conference room. He told me his story, and it was mind-blowing. I was like, "How could this be happening right here in Fremont,
And it,
Alameda
and
County?"
this was so there's been a number of different cases against Tesla, but
So this
this was a race case out of the Fremont factory, correct?
Yeah, it was probably the first one of the very first that came out, and it was an individual who was a production associate there, and, he talked about his hopes and dreams of coming to work for Elon Musk, and he moved all the way from Alabama to California, got this job, was so excited, but what he experienced at Tesla was unreal. It was I could not believe it until I started seeing his videos on his phone, and I was like, "Whoa, did you really experience this?" And then we prepared a lawsuit on his behalf, a complaint. We filed it, and after we filed that complaint, we started getting more calls. And we're like, "Whoa, hold on, he's not the only one."
Mm.
And that's when we got, so the first man was with Lambert, and then that's when we got the father and son. Um, Owen Diaz was the father, and he reached out, and Dimitri was his son. And then that's when we filed the case on their behalf. Um, DeWitt Lambert had signed an arbitration agreement because he was a production associate. That's why you've never heard of that case because it went over to arbitration and he's never had his day in court. The big difference with the Diaz father and son is they were contract attorneys. Sorry, not contract.
Contract employees.
They were contractors. And
Yeah.
so they never signed that arbitration agreement, so they had
Mm.
their day in court, which is why people today know about their case, and know about what goes on inside Tesla. And the the crazy part is even after we filed Owen and Dimitri Diaz's case, the calls kept coming. We kept getting calls from so many production associates that eventually we filed a class action. So Vaughn v. Tesla right now, Marcus Vaughn is the class representative. It's still being litigated, and there are so many people that have been impacted in a very similar way throughout Tesla. And it's I think it was a phenomenal experience for me. It's very sad that this had to be the case, but just because it's so horrific, but it was a phenomenal experience for me to see how a case progresses from the very inception and how it matters what your rights are when you sign away by an arbitration agreement versus when you get to go in court and the power of that and
Right.
all the appeals that happen in between and then actually progressing to a class action case. So the development of it, I think, was a very enriching educational opportunity for
What
me.
was it like being involved in such a high profile case that captured headlines?
I I don't know if it was very different from any other case to me, at least, because for me, like, the focus is really the client and what we're able to do. Um, I think the Judge Orrick was very good. He said, "Don't talk to media. I don't wanna hear about it." And so I think at least during the trial, all the attorneys were very hush hush about what was going on and talking to the media. Um, so I think it's good their story was heard. I think it's important for um, at least Californians to know what's going on here in Alameda County and try to, institute some sort of change for progress. Since the class action case was filed, I believe the California Civil Rights Department got involved, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission got involved. So it clearly, um, the awareness is there now.
Yeah, yeah. Now it kind of parallels to you coming to America. You had a major change in your career. You went on your own. You started your own firm a couple years ago, um, which is not easy to do. I can say, having done it myself, it's hard to set up a new firm. There's so many challenges. What was that experience like for you going out, leaving California Civil Rights Law Group and starting your own firm?
Where do I start? Oh God. I still remember being so excited. Well, to back off, I've never really thought I'd be running my own firm, although I guess I have both parents who were business owners. And so I've seen through my mom, what are the challenges that come with growing in, music school. She was a musician. And I've seen through my dad the stress and the crazy hours you put in, when you really care about something. So I had an idea, but it's like one of those experiences you really don't know what it's like until you actually do it.
Sure.
So I remember when I first launched, I was so excited. I was like, ready. Okay, I'm ready to go. And then I remember working the first half a year very hard, I would say. Probably not the hardest in my life, but very, very hard. And then I still remember in January sitting down with my husband and thinking, I don't know if I can do this.
Mm,
You have that moment because you're wearing so many hats, you have so many responsibilities, you have so many people looking up and counting on you, and it's just you.
yeah.
And, there's, the financial aspect too, because it's a risk. And in the contingency fee business, like I don't charge my clients hourly. I
And I was going to point that out because that makes starting a business in this realm so much more challenging because it's not like you're doing a fee for services type of business. You, as you said, you only get paid if you're successful. So that adds a whole nother element of risk for you.
exactly. And so when a contingency fee world, when you take on cases, they progress and develop sometimes over half a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 3 years, sometimes four. Right now, I have a case that I'm ready to file, which I know the other side's going to appeal and is going to be hanging out for 3 years
Mm,
somewhere. So when I started off, yeah, I was working very hard, and I would say in January of my first half a year, I looked at my husband. I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna make it. And then, there was a snowball effect. Something happened in February, and all the cases I was working on, a good portion of them just started resolving. And that is one of the best feelings is when you can see your clients finally being able to move on in their chapter in their life and putting closure to the scary chapter, and you're able to move on. And, it's the spring really, I think I'm glad I waited that extra month when the snowball effect kicked in because it really, I think, solidified that I was on the right path. I was doing the right thing. And if I can do it again, I mean, I would do it in a heartbeat. There's nothing like having your own firm, I would say, at least in my opinion, based on my personality type that I've learned.
yeah, yeah. And now, when we were chatting before this, a couple of comments kind of stood out for me. You said, I generally like safety. I don't like taking risks and I avoid battles. And you are a business owner and a litigator. So I'm curious, like, how do you manage a business where you have to take risks and there is no inherent safety and you have to go to battle?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm spot on. I avoid battles whenever I can, like as often as I can, but that I don't ever compromise on who I am or what my business is. So I'll avoid it to a certain extent. Um, I think honestly, information and knowledge is the key, and that's the key that really helps me make decisions. And whether I'm making a decision about what I should recommend to a client, or whether I'm making a decision on whether I should purchase a particular product or engage in, hire another associate, it's really what information I have at that given time, what additional information I can get, because with clients, I want to make sure I give them the best assessment I can. So I want to know what the other side is thinking. I want to know my client's perspective, but more importantly, even more so, the other side's perspective, and then assess them. And if my client has a horrible case, I'm going to tell her you have a horrible case, or him, and say, I'm sorry, I can't help. Or if I can help, then I would outline, look, there are 3 or 4 risks. This is how you have to assess it. You have to take into account those risks. And I think same thing in business, right? When we're making decisions, whether I want to get a new product or bring on an associate, it's like really, what is the need for it? What information do I have about, what's ahead? Um, but yeah, I'm not a fan of the roller coaster. I have to say, I'm a huge fan of I love my job. I think that that's probably the reason why I'm still doing it is because I can work forever, and my family laughs because my family is like, "Okay, you gotta stop. You gotta take a
Yeah.
week," because I genuinely enjoy it so much, it doesn't feel like work to me. Um, but yeah, I think
Mm.
information is the easiest way to really make up the, gap
Yeah.
when making decisions and, trying to avoid battles.
Yeah. And you've got a high profile case, I guess, against University of California, not a small defendant. You filed a case against them. Talk a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so, it's interesting after I launched my firm, most of my cases right now are sexual assault cases because I do work with a lot of sexual assault victims and also whistleblower cases. And this client of mine, who on whose behalf we filed the lawsuit, she was a very committed employee. She came in with with a particular promise, but then she saw some conduct take place that she thought was not okay, and she complained about it, and shortly thereafter gets fired. Um, but yeah, whistleblower cases are probably, also one of my favorite type of cases to handle because it's very often you have the individual putting their interest, taking a risk, and speaking up to do the right thing in order to either protect the institution, protect the employer, protect some employees. It's a very noble act that I think. In this particular case, the client was speaking up to try to protect the donors themselves, as well as the institution. And the treatment she received, I think, was very unwarranted. And hopefully, she will get some justice eventually.
Yeah. And, you know, without reading too much into your background, it's interesting to me that here you are, an immigrant to this country, and, you are standing up for this fundamental principle of protecting someone who reports wrongdoing. Um, I think that's a really interesting, evolution for you. Can you reflect a little bit on, how, how that, moves you and motivates you? Being the one to stand up and use the system that we have here, in order to protect underrepresented, to protect people that are being retaliated against.
Yeah, I don't know if me being an immigrant has much to do with it or where I am, but I think I've, just like I initially mentioned those dinner conversations, I really feel when I feel a sense of injustice and the person standing up to speak the truth, I am very eager to help in any way I can. Because, I've been in those situations, I've been in situations where, I thought something was not okay. Let's say, and it happened to be, a conservative group of people maybe, and mostly men. And I spoke out and it just, uh, the reaction might not have been the best one that I got, but I didn't feel, equally welcomed. But although I was trying to speak up for something that was potentially, important and would have helped. Um, I don't know, maybe it is a cultural difference. I'm not sure, but I think I've always had this desire to protect the underdog, protect the person, the individual who was trying to do the right thing. And often they are such good human beings and they just want to make sure that actually the more vulnerable are protected, the people who don't know about the harm that's being done to them. So it's an interesting cycle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Nav, this has been great. I'd love to share with everyone how they can get in touch with you, where they can go to learn about you and about your firm.
Yeah, John, sure. You can visit me on my website at avlonilaw.com, or you can, of course, send me an email always. It's Navruz at avlonilaw.com if you have any questions. Thank you so much, John.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nav.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast. This episode is powered by Rise 25. Please subscribe and check out future episodes.